And it was this land, the hill country around Hebron and Beersheba. But on at least 2 occasions, Abraham visited the area of Jerusalem. The first time was when he met Melchizedek. Melchizedek was king of Salem, and the town was located in those days on Mount Ophel, just south of today's walled city. Many years later, God brought Abraham back to the land of Moriah, and Elias Suba recalls what happened.
I can assure you we are on Mount Moriah. And Moriah means the chosen place, connected with our great father Abraham. I don't believe anybody will do as Abraham did, bringing his only child from Beersheba, which is about 55 miles south of here, to sacrifice him on the summit of Moriah.
But the father of the faithful spent most of his life in less dramatic ways. He was a shepherd. He lived in tents and followed his flocks. In time of famine, according to Genesis 12, Abraham and Sarah went down into Egypt. They would have followed an ancient road called the Way of the Sea. That road still winds through the hills of Judea and is still traveled today. It's hard to realize that the wonders of Egypt, the pyramids and the Sphinx, were already nearly 1,000 years old when Abraham went to Egypt in search of food. Who knows? Perhaps Abraham and Sarah gazed in wonder at the pyramids just as modern tourists do. After the famine was over, Abraham returned to the hills of Judea and to the Bedouin way of life. God blessed Abraham, and the Bible says he became a wealthy man, but his wealth was in his flocks. He lived in tents, wandered with his flocks, and never owned any land. When his beloved Sarah died, Abraham had no burial place, so he bought the cave of Machpelah from Ephron the Hittite for a family tomb. The tomb of the patriarchs is built over the cave of Machpelah. When Sarah died, Abraham purchased the cave of Machpelah from Ephron the Hittite. Sarah was buried here in the cave, later Abraham, then Isaac and Rebekah, later Jacob and Leah. Just before the birth of Jesus, Herod the Great built the great walls that you see. They're Herodian going back to the 1st century. Later in Crusader days, it became a church. No one is able to visit the cave beneath this building now, but underneath this building in the cave of Machpelah, there is buried Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob. Notice the beautiful Herodian stones with the beveled edges. These walls were built by Herod the Great 20 or 30 years before Jesus was born. Herod was such a builder that we see stones like these all over the Bible land. There are many scenes in the Bible land today that are reminiscent of the days of Abraham and Sarah. The sheep still graze on the hills around Hebron. The Arab women still wear the beautiful old dresses, and they carry their shopping baskets or water jars on their heads. These dresses are embroidered by hand, and each village has its own distinctive style, like this beautiful dress that came from a little Arab village in the Galilee. The shepherds still wash their sheep before they shear them. These shepherd boys have brought their sheep all the way from Tekoa to Jerusalem because there's a pool here. The water comes from the Gihon spring. This spring was flowing in the days of Abraham. It provided a water supply for Jerusalem, and it's still flowing today. Some of these sheep aren't too happy about getting a bath, and some of them are about as big as the shepherd boys. But from the days of Abraham, from the days of David, this is what shepherd boys have done. Abraham lived nearly 4,000 years ago, but among the Arabs on the West Bank today, there are Bedouin families whose way of life hasn't changed very much. Here's a Bedouin family that lives in the Jordan Valley west of Jericho. They have a goat's hair tent with a dirt floor. Their wealth is counted in goats and sheep. The old man's about 80. His face shows the years that he spent out in the sun. He knows little about the modern world. No electricity, no running water, no bathroom, no doctors or nurses. He has grandchildren, and they're playing around the tent, some of them without too many clothes or too many baths. His wife wears typical Bedouin dress. She has the grandchildren around her, and she's rocking the youngest in a swing. He smiles, and he doesn't seem to mind the flies, at least not as much as we do. A Bedouin family in the Bible land today. But as you look at this face, you might be seeing the face of Abraham. Elias Suba comes from the Tamara Bedouin tribe. He grew up as a shepherd boy at Bethlehem.
I'm proud of those nomads because our great father Abraham was of one of them. Now those nomads, they never settle in a place. They keep following water and grass. They're black tents. They're hand woven out of goat's hair. They are very generous people, very honest people too, do believe me? Suppose a strange lady getting into one of those Bedouin tents and want to spend a night. I have seen this in my own eyes, that the host will stick his knife next to her bed. That means she's protected, will be no harm. So those nomads living the same way as our great father Abraham. Now move one of them to the Intercontinental or Holiday Inn, he will tell you, please leave me alone, take me back to my tent. And the average of life among them over 100 years.
Here's another Bedouin man in a better tent who plays on a primitive one-string instrument. And he even makes a melody on a coffee mill. As Elias said, the Bedouin are hospitable people. The coffee pot is always ready, but beware, it's been brewing for hours. But there are some things Abraham wouldn't recognize, like a Bedouin tent with a battery-powered television, or the camels that still graze in the desert, how they're used mainly to entertain the tourists. Shushu was a friendly camel. She gave me a bumpy ride, and then a smelly kiss. After the patriarchs, the Old Testament tells about Israel's sojourn in Egypt, the Exodus, and the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. Yonder in the distance is Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses, for 2,000 years believed to be Mount Sinai. The Sinai is a barren desert. The Bible calls it the great and terrible wilderness, with fiery scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water. With rainfall of 2 or 3 inches a year, only a few plants can grow. Moses led the people of Israel to Mount Sinai, and there he met God and received the law. St. Catherine's Monastery is at the base of Mount Sinai, with Mount Jethro, named for Moses' father-in-law, in the distance. St. Catherine's Monastery was built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. It's now 1,400 years old and has never been attacked or destroyed. The church in the monastery is one of the oldest in the Christian world. The monks believe that this vine growing out from under the church is the burning bush where God spoke to Moses. The monastery has a priceless collection of art and manuscripts, like this 7th century painting of Peter and this mosaic of Moses in the burning bush. The charnel house is a pretty whitewashed building, but inside are the skulls and bones of hundreds of monks who have died at the monastery across the centuries. There's a large plain near the monastery, perhaps where Israel encamped for a year. Let's spend the night at the monastery and then climb Mount Sinai. Because of the desert heat, we leave long before dawn, and as the first light appears, we're near the summit. Mount Sinai is 7,500 feet high, and from the summit we view the barren peaks around us. Despite the blistering heat of the desert, there's a lonely grandeur about the Sinai. It was somewhere on one of these rocky mountains that God said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And God made a covenant with Israel and gave them the tables of stone and the law. There's a flight of steps, nearly 4,000 of them, back down to the monastery. These steps have been built by the monks across the ages as works of penance for their sins. It's a long, strenuous climb down, and when the monastery finally appears, it's a happy sight. Who knows? Perhaps we have been to the very mountain where Moses met God and came back down to the people with the laws of God written on tables of stone. Israel began the conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua, and Jericho was the first city they captured. There are springs of water at Jericho, have been for thousands of years, so the city's an oasis, but there's a desert around it. Further down in the wilderness of Judea, it's even worse. But in Joshua's day, the spies said that it was a land flowing with milk and honey. And we know that in ancient times, the hills were covered with forests, cedar, oak, pine. What happened? The answer is that as ancient armies plundered the land, they cut down the trees. Then the land was overgrazed, too many goats, too many cattle, and a land flowing with milk and honey became desert. Today it's changing. In the last 40 years, over 100 million trees have been planted. There are beautiful new vineyards around Hebron. This cluster of grapes may not be as big as the one the spies brought back, but with irrigation, the Bible land is blooming again. The tell of ancient Jericho has been excavated by John Garstang and Kathleen Kenyon. They have not found the walls of Joshua's day. They were destroyed so completely. They have found a large stone tower that may be 6,000 or 7,000 years old. We're on the Mound of Hazor, about 10 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, the last major city that Joshua conquered. The Bible talks about cities that were built on mounds, and as we approach Hazor, we see the mound, or the tell as the archaeologists call it. It's large, 25 acres, so this was the major Canaanite city in the north. Archaeologists have found the enormous cistern that provided a water supply for the city. There are more than 100 steps going down into the cistern. Hazor was a walled city and even had a moat around it. Hazor was later rebuilt by Solomon to be one of his chariot cities. This large storage room with the pillars was built by Solomon, or perhaps by King Ahab, who continued to build at Hazor. Notice the beauty of the Jordan Valley stretching out beyond the ruins of Hazor. Hussein's a Bedouin. He used to be a shepherd, but now he works for the National Park Service at Hazor. Hussein plays a simple flute, just like he did when he was a shepherd in the Galilee. Bet-Shan appears in the Old Testament at a tragic time, the death of Saul and Jonathan. They were killed at Mount Gilboa, and the Philistines cut off King Saul's head and fastened his body to the city wall at Bet-Shan. Here's the mound of that ancient city with a solitary tree growing on the summit. 1,000 years later, a great Roman theater was built at Bet-Shan. It's been uncovered, and this is the best preserved ancient theater anywhere in the Bible land.
And this is the only theater in the Holy Land was used for execution. That's where they used to bring the Christians, throw them to the lions here. Then there is another one on the east bank of the River Jordan at Jerash. So this is the only one here had been founded, and as I say, never been restored as it was founded.
Tell me about the air conditioning.
Well, those in that time, there were no air conditioning, so they used to build square pools, fill them up with water all around, with a passage bringing the cool air in, so the cool breeze will be going into the theater.
So they were in air-conditioned comfort when they were watching the Christians being killed.
Right, right.
The death of Saul and Jonathan at Bet-Shan was one of the darkest hours in Israel's history. But just ahead, under David and Solomon, the nation would be strong and prosperous. We'll talk about this in our next visit to the Bible land.